What do you think the HW administration got right? And what exactly did you see as his vision for foreign policy?
Well, before I can explain H.W. Bush, I need to take us back a step. American foreign policy during the Cold War was strongly bipartisan, and it was based in the concept that we need an alliance to fight the Soviet Union, that in any direct conflict between the two countries, if we didn't have a bevy of allies between us and them, it would immediately go nuclear, and that would obviously end badly for everybody. So at the end of World War II, we disbanded the imperial system. We told everybody around the table at Bretton Woods and at the meetings after the war that the imperial system and the competition that it generated are what brought us to the world wars. So instead, we are going to be in charge of security policy for everyone and make all the big decisions and coordinate all the allies. And in exchange, we would not only defend everyone who was involved in the alliance structure, we would create this thing called free trade and globalization, so that every country that was part of the alliance and beyond could participate in an international trading network without having to build a military system in order to enforce that trade. So, old imperial, you traded with your colonies and you shot at everybody else. Oversimplification, but that's basically how it went down. In the Cold War and in the free trade era, the United States would defend everybody's commerce so that everyone could become rich as if they had won the war all by themselves and were a global empire. It was a great bribe, and it worked. George Herbert Walker Bush was the last president of that network. He was there when the Soviet Union finally fell, and all of a sudden this guns for butter trade that we had worked out back in the 40s no longer seemed to apply. So his goal was to transition the everything is about the Cold War mentality to everything is about something new: democracy, human rights, women's rights, generally not being a jerk to each other. The whole 1,000 points of light, the whole New World Order idea was his, to create a completely new international system that used free trade and globalization as the bribe still, but to achieve a different sort of goals beyond simply avoiding nuclear Armageddon. It was a brilliant idea. And he brought in a lot of people from the left, the center, and the right in order to make it happen. But in the United States, we love to punish people who have been successful, so we voted him out of office. And he had at most a year to implement his vision, and then he was replaced by a guy who said it's the economy, stupid, and didn't honestly do anything with foreign policy for his first 3 years.
It's rather ironic given the background that H.W. Bush brought to the White House and some of his actions, his foreign policy actions, specifically in the context of Latin America. His defense of an order that was not necessarily based on the values that he was aiming to promote a little bit later on.
Well, U.S. policy in Latin America has always been a little bit different from U.S. policy for the rest of the world. Monroe Doctrine has always been alive and strong in American strategic thinking, and Herbert Walker Bush was no change from that mindset. I would add that Clinton, W., Obama, and now Trump have, in essence, carried on the mechanics of the global order of the Cold War. And in the aftermath of the Cold War, a lot of the Latin American countries have informally joined that network. And that's the story of not just the Mexico boom, but the Brazil boom and the fact that Argentina hasn't completely fallen apart.
Yet.
I don't think they will, but wow, do they like to be at the edge.
All right, well, in that case, we'll move right along. Because there's also the Clinton presidency, and I know you have a lot of thoughts specifically on the absence of movement, or at least the absence of forward momentum. But we can say that Clinton did move things along in the sense that, I'm thinking notably of the expansion of NATO and his actions to sort of increase the scale of globalization and push the border back in Europe, bring the Europeans more fully into the international order, particularly the Eastern Europeans. So what are the missed opportunities you feel that the Clinton administration could have taken advantage of?
I'm going to pretty much disagree with everything you just said about Bill Clinton.
By all means.
He literally woke up one day in 1997 and said, hey, let's expand NATO. None of the security work was done. None of the vetting of the intelligence services of those countries was done. Hell, Hungary was brought in, didn't even have a land border with the rest of the European countries that were part of the alliance structure. It was done in the most slapdash way possible. And that, when it came to foreign policy, that was kind of Bill Clinton's style. He wasn't interested in foreign affairs. And if there was a summit the next day, he would get together with all of the folks in the American bureaucracy who knew what what the country was all about, and he'd study for the test, and he'd hit out of the park because he was great in a one-on-one or a small group setting, but there was never any follow-up. So there were no troops deployed. There was no integration of NATO norms with these new countries that had been former Soviet pacs. They kept running all of their old Soviet-era hardware until 10 years later. Clinton just wasn't the guy for that. If we had the Herbert Walker Bush team for a second term, people like Robert Gates, I have no doubt that one of two things would have happened. Either number one, we would have had better relations with the Russians, which would have made NATO moot, which would have been, honestly, the goal of the organization all along. Or number two, relations with the Russians would have come to a head very early, and we would have expanded to the NATO footprint that we have now 25 years later, within the first 5 years. Either way, there would have been a lot more clarity as to what American goals are and where the lines are. And instead, we kind of went through this wishy-washy period that started with Clinton, continued under W, intensified under Obama, and ultimately fell apart among Trump, where honestly, nobody trusts anybody anymore.
All right. Well, that brings us more or less to the Iraq War, talking about wishy-washy things that no one seems to know what to do with. And this is a topic that is incredibly contentious because there are so many prevailing narratives that just haven't really been re-examined since the mid 2000s, and no one seems to have much of a handle on what happened, what it was, what it meant. So I was wondering if you could bring a fresh perspective. What exactly happened?
So from the folks that I know in the defense and the intelligence community, the basic goal was very simple. It was in the aftermath of 9/11, we knew we lacked the skill set and the force posture to go after al-Qaeda. We attempted to get them in Afghanistan, and when they were holed up in Tora Bora, we realized that the number of troops we had in the area was insufficient to the task. So the Joint Chiefs brought W. Bush the option of nuking Tora Bora 11 times. Because that's what it would have taken to guarantee that the tunnel systems under the mountain would have actually collapsed. And, say what you will about W. Bush, he was like, that strikes me as excessive. So the folks in al-Qaeda got away. They went west through Iran where the U.S. couldn't go. The Iranians knew that they were passing through, and then they dispersed. And that condemned us to playing a whack-a-mole game throughout the entire Middle East. And since we can't invade the entire Middle East simultaneously, the solution that was struck upon was to get the Middle Eastern countries to do it for us. So we invaded Iraq. Not because we thought they were in Iraq. They weren't. But because by putting an armored brigade in Fallujah, and you don't use an armored brigade to do urban pacification. That's infantry, not tanks. It threatened Syria and Saudi Arabia and Iran because they didn't know what we were going to do next. So they destroyed al-Qaeda for us. And it worked. Unfortunately, we didn't pull the plug at that point because that was back in 2003, early 2004. And so the decision was made at the top, try to make Iraq look like Wisconsin. And that's where it all went to hell. So we shattered the Ba'ath Party. We destroyed all the traditional spheres of influence that made Iraq function. And then we tried to remake it somewhat in our image, and it completely fell apart. So the place descended into civil war and chaos. The Iranians got more influence in the country than they ever had before. And it took us 20 years to both admit that the strategy didn't work and admit